For 30 years, Johnny Carson was the undisputed king of American late-night television. Every weeknight, millions of viewers across the country settled into their living rooms, trusting Carson to deliver exactly what he always delivered: wit, warmth, and the kind of polished, controlled entertainment that made The Tonight Show the gold standard of broadcast television. Carson was, by every account of those who worked alongside him, a man of extraordinary discipline. He knew his show, he knew his audience, and above all else, he knew how to maintain command of every single moment that unfolded on that famous stage. But television, even at its most carefully produced, is ultimately a live and unpredictable medium. And Johnny Carson, for all his genius and professionalism, occasionally found himself sitting across from guests who operated by an entirely different set of rules. Guests who had no interest in playing the game the way it was supposed to be played. Guests who arrived on that stage with zero shame, zero filters, and absolutely zero concern for the carefully constructed world Carson had built around himself. These were the guests who made producers sweat and network executives reach for their phones. The guests who turned a precisely timed television program into something raw, unpredictable, and occasionally magnificent. Tonight, we are counting down 10 of the most shameless, boundary-shattering, control-demolishing guests ever to sit across from Johnny Carson. These are the people who prove that sometimes the most unforgettable television is the kind that nobody planned. If you want to understand what it felt like to watch Johnny Carson lose control of his own television show, all you had to do was tune in on any night when Shelley Winters was a guest. The two-time Academy Award-winning actress was, by every account of Tonight Show veterans, something close to a force of nature dressed in pearls and carrying an oversized handbag that functioned as a prop department for whatever chaos she had planned for the evening. Winters was not a difficult guest in the traditional sense. She was not rude, she was not cruel, and she was not trying to sabotage the program. She was simply completely and irreversibly incapable of operating within the time constraints and conversational boundaries that a network talk show required. Her stories did not have endings so much as they had new beginnings. A question about her latest film might become a 30-minute journey through 3 decades of Hollywood history, 2 failed marriages, a political opinion that made the Standards and Practices Department visibly nervous, and a personal revelation so unexpected that Carson would glance at his watch with the quiet desperation of a man realizing he has just missed his last bus home. The backstage atmosphere before Winters' appearance was reportedly unlike anything else in The Tonight Show's history. Production assistants would warn each other in hushed voices. Guests scheduled to appear after her would mentally prepare for their segments to be cut entirely. And somewhere in the building, a producer would be quietly building extra time into the rundown, knowing that whatever plan existed for the evening was about to become a suggestion rather than a schedule. What made Winters genuinely legendary, though, was not merely her disregard for timing. It was her complete comfort with creating uncomfortable moments. She would drop bombshell statements with the casual ease of someone commenting on the weather, then sit back and watch with apparent satisfaction as Carson scrambled to find a graceful path forward. She was, in the most theatrical sense possible, absolutely shameless, and the audience loved every chaotic minute of it. There were guests who pushed boundaries on The Tonight Show, and then there was Richard Pryor, who arrived each time as though the concept of a boundary was something that had been invented specifically for other people. The revolutionary comedian did not develop a sanitized television version of himself for Carson's mainstream audience. He simply showed up as exactly the person he was, unfiltered, searingly honest, and utterly unconcerned with the comfort levels of network executives watching from their offices. Pryor's Tonight Show appearances during the 1970s and early 1980s were unlike anything else happening on American television at the time. He spoke openly about his drug addiction not as a cautionary tale neatly resolved, but as an ongoing reality of his life. He addressed race in America with an unflinching directness that left audiences simultaneously uncomfortable and riveted. He discussed his personal failures and struggles with a candor that most celebrities of that era would have considered professional suicide. What was remarkable was Carson's response to all of this. Rather than redirecting Pryor or quietly signaling discomfort, Carson listened with what colleagues described as genuine fascination and evident respect. He understood, apparently instinctively, that what Pryor was doing was not recklessness for its own sake. It was artistry. It was a comedian using his platform to tell truths that the rest of American television was carefully avoiding. Carson defended Pryor to network executives on multiple occasions, reportedly arguing that his cultural importance was simply too significant to be diminished by conventional broadcast standards. In 30 years of hosting, there were very few guests Carson extended that kind of unwavering protection to. Richard Pryor was one of them. Most of the guests on this list were shameless in ways that created genuine chaos. Zsa Zsa Gabor was shameless in a way that was considerably more sophisticated, because her shamelessness was, in fact, a brilliantly calculated performance that she had been rehearsing and refining for decades. Gabor arrived on the Tonight Show stage trailing diamonds, perfume, and a carefully cultivated reputational woman who had lived more dramatically than anyone had a right to. Her 9 marriages were not a source of embarrassment to her. They were her primary material. Her romantic escapades, her financial settlements, her opinions about the men who had failed to hold her interest, all of it was deployed with the precision of someone who understood exactly which revelations would generate the next morning's headlines. Carson recognized the performance immediately and became her perfect collaborator. He would react with exaggerated shock to revelations he clearly anticipated, while occasionally allowing the audience a subtle acknowledgement that they were all participating together in a very entertaining piece of theater. What made Gabor genuinely remarkable, viewed from any distance, was a business intelligence underlying the whole performance. At a time when Hollywood routinely discarded women as their careers aged, Gabor had constructed a persona that actually grew more valuable with every year and every additional scandal. She had transformed shamelessness into a sustainable career strategy, and she executed that strategy with a discipline that her apparent frivolity completely concealed. Carson once reportedly described her as entirely artificial and completely authentic at the same time, and he meant it as the highest possible compliment. She had invented a character, committed to it with total conviction, and in doing so had made herself genuinely unforgettable. Not every guest on this list arrived on the Tonight Show stage with a plan. Oliver Reed arrived in July of 1979 with something considerably simpler, a substantial quantity of bourbon, and an apparent conviction that the customs of American broadcast television did not particularly apply to him. The British actor, celebrated for powerful dramatic performances throughout his film career, was visibly and undeniably intoxicated from the moment he emerged onto the stage. He swayed. He slurred. He fixed Carson with the unervingly intense focus of someone working extremely hard to project sobriety while achieving the opposite effect. Backstage, staff had already attempted to slow his consumption before the segment and had been met with the kind of resistance that only a man of Reed's considerable physical presence could effectively communicate. What followed was one of the most genuinely uncomfortable interviews in Tonight Show history. Reed lurched between topics with no apparent logic, interrupted Carson repeatedly, and at one memorably awful moment directed a deeply inappropriate comment at a woman in the audience before inviting her to join him after the broadcast. Carson gave the signal to cut to commercial, a measure he employed with extreme reluctance throughout his entire career, and during the break, delivered what witnesses described as a very brief, very quiet remark to Reed that produced the immediate effect of a scolded schoolboy suddenly recognizing the magnitude of what he had done. Reed completed the remaining segment with noticeably improved behavior. He never returned to The Tonight Show, but his single appearance remains one of the most discussed evenings in the program's history, not because Carson lost control, but because of the extraordinary skill with which he managed a situation that would have destroyed lesser hosts entirely. There is a particular kind of shamelessness that belongs exclusively to those who have achieved so much, survived so much, and outlasted so many of their critics that the opinion of anyone currently listening has simply ceased to matter. Bette Davis had arrived at that place by the time she became a regular presence on The Tonight Show, and she occupied it with a regal composure that made her the most formidable truth-teller Carson ever welcomed onto his stage. Davis had 2 Academy Awards. She had decades of acclaimed work. She had been celebrated, forgotten, rediscovered, and celebrated again. She had watched Hollywood treat women with the casual cruelty of an industry that valued youth above almost everything else, and she had survived it all with her perspective not merely intact, but sharpened to a point. By the time she sat down across from Carson, she had absolutely nothing to lose and absolutely no interest in pretending otherwise. She named names. She assessed the professional shortcomings of directors and co-stars with surgical precision. She described the experience of aging in Hollywood with a bluntness that made audiences audibly gasp. Not because she was wrong, but because the truth she was speaking so plainly was one the industry had always preferred to keep quiet. What elevated Davis beyond mere controversy was the quality of her delivery. She was not bitter. She was not angry. She was witty, composed, and devastating in exactly the way that only someone with her lifetime of accumulated experience could manage to be. Carson, who spent his career steering conversations and managing guests, essentially surrendered that role whenever Davis was in the chair. He sat back, asked occasional questions, and listened, recognizing that what she was offering was something his show rarely produced. Pure, unvarnished, expertly delivered truth. Every guest on this list challenged Carson's authority, in one way or another. Don Rickles did something considerably more audacious. He walked onto Carson's stage and made Carson himself a target, night after night, with an aggression and fearlessness that no other performer in television history quite managed to replicate. Rickles was Carson's close personal friend, and that friendship was a foundation on which everything else rested. Without it, his appearances would have been unthinkable. With it, they became some of the most electrically entertaining moments in The Tonight Show's history. He insulted Carson's clothing, his hair, his marriages, his age, and his television competition, often within the first 60 seconds of taking his seat. The audience, understanding that they were witnessing something genuinely unique, responded with a delighted shock that Rickles had perfected over decades of live performance. What viewers at home rarely appreciated was a precision operating beneath the apparent chaos. Rickles was acutely aware of the constraints of network television and calibrated his material accordingly. The insults felt completely unfiltered because he was extraordinarily skilled at creating that impression, while remaining carefully within the limits of what the broadcast could sustain. There was one occasion when Rickles went genuinely too far, orchestrating what he described as a tribute but which functioned in execution as an ambush involving personal material that Carson had never approved. The breach of trust was serious, and those who worked closely with Carson remembered his uncharacteristic silence during the commercial break that followed as something that made the entire control room deeply uncomfortable. The friendship survived because what existed between the two men was real, but it was, by several accounts, a considerably closer call than anyone involved was comfortable admitting. Robin Williams did not push boundaries on The Tonight Show. He simply proceeded as though boundaries were a concept that had never occurred to him, leaving Carson and his entire production team to reorganize themselves around whatever reality Williams was currently constructing at high speed. A Williams appearance began with the abandonment of the plan. Whatever questions Carson had prepared, whatever segments had been scheduled, whatever timing the rundown required, all of it became immediately irrelevant the moment Williams settled into the guest chair and his mind began moving at the velocity it always moved at. A simple question about his latest project might become a 15-minute improvised universe populated by characters performed in multiple accents with full physical commitment, leaving Carson and the audience equally breathless and equally uncertain where the next moment would land. Carson's response to Williams was, by every account, unlike his response to any other guest in 30 years of hosting. He surrendered, not reluctantly, not professionally, but with what colleagues consistently described as genuine childlike delight. He became an audience member on his own show, content to feed Williams an occasional new premise, and otherwise simply enjoy the spectacle of a mind operating at a level that conventional television had no framework for containing. The production team adapted as best they could. Camera operators were instructed to simply follow Williams wherever he went. Commercial breaks were called whenever he happened to pause for breath. Other guests were sometimes moved the following evening, when Williams had consumed the available broadcast time so completely that bringing anyone else out felt like an interruption of something too extraordinary to interrupt. Joan Rivers arrived on The Tonight Show as a comedian and stayed as something considerably more complicated, a brilliantly funny, savagely honest, and occasionally infuriating presence whose relationship with Carson became one of the most celebrated and ultimately most painful partnerships in late-night history. At her best, Rivers was electrifying. She brought a brand of comedy that was unlike anything else on Carson's stage, self-deprecating to a degree that was almost uncomfortable, brutally observational, and absolutely fearless about the subject she was willing to address. Her willingness to discuss her own insecurities, her marriage, her body, and her professional struggles with an openness that most female comedians of her era never approached gave her a connection with audiences that was immediate and visceral. Carson recognized her talent early and championed her publicly, naming her as permanent guest host, an honor that represented the highest professional endorsement he could offer. When Rivers accepted a competing network's offer to host her own late-night program without informing Carson in advance, the breach was permanent. He never spoke to her publicly again. Those who knew him well described his reaction as one of the few genuine wounds his long career in television ever produced. But before that ending, there was an extraordinary run of Tonight Show appearances that demonstrated what zero shame, deployed with genius-level comic skill, could produce on a great stage with a great audience. Rivers remains one of the most significant comedians of the 20th century, and The Tonight Show was where much of that significance was first established. Marlon Brando appeared on The Tonight Show on relatively few occasions, but each appearance was, by every account, a masterclass in what happens when an artist of supreme self-confidence decides that the normal obligations of a promotional television appearance simply do not apply to him. Brando arrived without any apparent interest in discussing whatever project he was theoretically there to promote. He arrived with opinions about acting, about Hollywood, about American culture, about politics, about the film industry's treatment of marginalized communities, about the nature of celebrity itself. And he intended to share those opinions at whatever length and in whatever direction seemed appropriate to him at that moment. He was, by any measure, extraordinary to watch. His intelligence was evident in every sentence, and his complete indifference to his own carefully managed public image gave his Tonight Show appearances a quality of authenticity that was almost jarring in a medium built on self-promotion. Carson, who had managed 30 years of difficult guests with unflappable professionalism, reportedly found Brando both genuinely fascinating and genuinely challenging in equal measure. Here was a man who could not be steered, redirected, or managed, not because he was out of control, but because he was, if anything, too entirely himself the medium he was appearing in. The most shameless thing that ever happened on The Tonight Show may have been the thing that happened quietly every single night. For 30 years, a man sitting behind a desk pretending that he was not one of the most powerful and carefully self-constructed figures in American entertainment, while those extraordinary guests periodically pulled the curtain aside and revealed something true. Carson was, paradoxically, the most controlled and the most authentic personality that late-night television ever produced. He maintained his private self with a discipline so complete that those who worked with him daily felt they barely knew him. He was funny, brilliant, and warm on camera, and genuinely unknowable off it. What makes the guests on this list so fascinating is not merely their own shamelessness, but what their shamelessness revealed about Carson. With Pryor, we saw his respect for genuine artistic integrity. With Rickles, his capacity for friendship and forgiveness. With Williams, his ability to relinquish control when something genuinely greater than control presented itself. With Davis, his recognition that earned authority deserves a platform and an audience. The Tonight Show was, for 30 years, the most reliable and disciplined broadcast in American television. But its most memorable moments were almost always the ones that nobody planned, the moments when someone across the desk from Johnny Carson had the audacity, the courage, or the magnificent recklessness to simply be entirely themselves. Those moments did not diminish what Carson built. They completed it.